I am 81 years old, and for the last 11 years I have been carrying something that has cost me more sleep than my 2 tours in Vietnam, more guilt than my divorce, and more grief than burying my son. I don't say that lightly. I buried my son in 2003. I know what grief is. I know the weight of it, how it sits in your chest like a stone that never quite dissolves, how you wake up at 3 in the morning, and for 1/2 second you forget, and then you remember, and it hits you fresh every single time. I know that grief. And I'm telling you that what happened on my property between 2013 and 2014 has matched it. Some nights it's beaten it. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a man who chases stories. I am not a man who watches those cable television programs about monsters in the woods. And I want to be very direct here, I am not the kind of man who believes things without evidence. I spent 22 years in the United States Army, most of it in military intelligence. I was trained specifically and deliberately to question sources, verify claims, and reject conclusions that outpaced the available evidence. That training doesn't leave you. It becomes the architecture of how you think. So, when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, understand that I fought against it. I argued with myself for months. I built alternative explanations and stress-tested them, and watched them fall apart one by one, until there was nothing left standing except the thing I didn't want to accept. My name doesn't matter. My farm is in the western lower peninsula of Michigan, about 40 minutes east of Lake Michigan, in a county I won't name, on a road I won't name, and I'd appreciate it if anyone who thinks they recognize the details keeps that to themselves. I've lived out here since 1998, bought the property after the divorce, after I retired from the Army, after I decided that what I needed more than anything else in the world was distance. Distance from people. Distance from noise. Distance from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your entire adult life inside institutions. The farm is 160 acres, mostly second-growth hardwood with about 30 acres of field on the southern end. There's a creek that runs along the eastern property line. There's a barn that was already old when I bought the place, and a farmhouse that I've spent 26 years making livable. I have a dog, had a dog then, she's gone now, a cattle dog named Petra, and I had, at the time this story begins, 4 trail cameras positioned around the property. I put the cameras up in 2011, originally for deer scouting. I'm a hunter. Have been since I was 8 years old. I use the cameras the way any serious deer hunter uses them, to pattern movement, to identify shooter bucks, to understand how animals use the land across different seasons. By 2013, I had a good system. Camera 1 was on the creek crossing in the northeast corner. Camera 2 was in the hardwoods on the west side, about 60 yards off the field edge. Camera 3 was on the south field covering a mineral lick, and Camera 4, the one that matters for this story, was mounted on a fence post beside what I call the back gate. The back gate is a simple steel tube gate on the northern edge of my property, set into a fence line that separates my land from a corridor of state forest that runs for about 12 miles without a paved road. That gate faces north. Nothing but trees on the other side of it. Deer used it. Turkeys used it. I'd gotten good footage of a coyote family using it for about 3 months in 2012. The camera was there because animals used it as a natural funnel point. That's all. That is all it was. I want to tell you the thing I found on that camera, but I need you to understand that by the time I found it, by the time I understood what I was looking at, what I was really looking at, 11 months had already passed. 11 months of footage I had not yet reviewed, because the summer and fall of 2013 had been, to put it plainly, a hard year. Petra had gone through a bad illness in June. I'd had a back surgery in August that laid me up for 6 weeks. My daughter called in September to tell me she was getting divorced, and I spent most of October either on the phone with her or driving to Grand Rapids to help with my grandkids. The cameras were still running. The SD cards were full by October, but I hadn't sat down to review them the way I normally would have. I was behind. I didn't get to it until late February 2014, during a cold stretch when there was nothing else to do, and I was finally, for the first time since the previous spring, sitting still. I reviewed camera 1 first. Normal deer activity, a few good bucks, one very large 8-point I hadn't seen before. Camera 2 had mostly squirrels and 1 fox. Camera 3 had deer, a raccoon, and a single image I still can't fully explain of what appeared to be a large black dog, enormous, too big for a coyote, standing at the mineral lick at 3:47 in the morning on September 12, 2013. I noted it, set it aside, filed it in the back of my mind as a domestic dog that had wandered from somewhere, though the nearest neighbor with dogs was 4 miles by road, and the image bothered me slightly because of the size. I told myself there were big dogs in the world. I moved on. Then I pulled the SD card from camera 4, the back gate camera. Before I tell you what was on it, I need to tell you one more thing. And this is important, so stay with me. The back gate camera had a motion-triggered video function that I had set to record 30-second clips rather than still images, because I'd had good luck in 2012 catching coyote behavior on video, and I wanted to be able to study movement patterns rather than just frozen frames. 30-second clips. That matters. Because what I got was not a photograph I could dismiss as a trick of light, a lens artifact, a branch in the wrong place at the right moment. I got video. Clear, time-stamped, 30-second video clips of something using my back gate. 112 clips over 11 months. The same subject. On 112 separate nights. I'm going to need a moment here, and I apologize because I know that's frustrating, but I'm 81 years old, and I still feel something physical in my chest when I think about sitting in that chair in February with the laptop open, watching clip after clip. My hands not quite steady. My dog, Petra, who was lying at my feet, sitting up at some point and pressing herself against my leg and not moving for the rest of the night. Animals know. That's not mysticism. That's just what I've observed in 60-plus years of living with animals. They pick up on the human emotional field in ways we haven't fully measured yet. Petra knew something was wrong with what I was seeing before I'd consciously admitted it to myself. I need to also mention, because my granddaughter set this up and she says I have to acknowledge things like this, that apparently there is an algorithm involved in whether you good people ever see this video. Some kind of invisible librarian that decides if my confession reaches the world or disappears into the void. She tried to explain it to me. I told her it sounded like the Army's personnel assignment system, and she told me that was surprisingly accurate. If you're watching this, apparently you've done something with your thumb that tells the algorithm I'm worth your time, and I want you to know I am grateful for it. And also that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, and my granddaughter's going to have to tell me afterward whether any of you watch this or if I talk to an empty room for an hour, like I sometimes do out here in the winter. All right, I'm done with that. Back to the gate. The first clip was from March 14, 2013, timestamp 2:09 a.m. The gate faces north, so the camera was pointing north with the fence line running east-west across the lower portion of the frame. Beyond the gate is a shallow slope that drops down into the state forest, and you can see maybe 15 yards into the trees before the darkness eats the image. The clip begins with the gate closed, the fence line still, a light snow falling. It had snowed that evening, I remember, because I'd plowed the driveway that afternoon. The motion trigger had been set off by something. For the first 4 seconds of the clip, nothing is visible. Then the gate moves, not violently, not thrown open. It moves the way a gate moves when something leans on it from the other side and pushes steadily, testing the latch. The latch held, I keep it wired in addition to the pin, an old habit, and then a hand came into frame. I want to be precise here. I said hand. I mean a hand-like appendage that was enormous, dark-furred, and that gripped the top horizontal bar of the gate with what I can only describe as familiarity. The way you or I grip a gate we've used before. Not frantically, not randomly, with intention and recognition. The creature, and I'm going to call it that now because there is no other word, leaned into the frame from the left side, and the camera caught it in profile for approximately 6 seconds before it appeared to register the camera's infrared and stepped back. But 6 seconds was enough. It was enough on that first night, and it was enough when I watched it on my laptop 11 months later. I am 6'1". I was, at the time of that footage, approximately 210 pounds, not in bad shape for 68. The thing at my gate was taller than my gate by perhaps 2 feet. My gate is 5 feet high. I've measured it. I built it. The animal at my gate stood 7 feet tall at minimum, was covered in dark brown to black fur that was longer on the arms and shorter and denser on the torso, and it walked on 2 legs. It did not drop to all 4s when it retreated from the camera. It backed up on 2 legs, turned on 2 legs, and disappeared into the trees on 2 legs. That was March 14th, 2013. Clip 2 was March 17th, then March 19th, then March 22nd, then every 3 or 4 nights through April. By May, it was coming every 2 nights. By July, it was coming almost nightly. By September, the month I was laid up from back surgery, it came every single night for 31 consecutive nights. Every night. 2 a.m., give or take 40 minutes in either direction. The same animal. I became certain of this because of 3 identifying features I noted after reviewing all 112 clips in sequence. First, a pale patch of fur on the inside of the left forearm, visible in any clip where the left arm was raised. Second, an asymmetrical gait where the right shoulder dropped slightly on each left foot strike, suggesting an old injury or structural difference. Third, and most distinctively, a behavior I noticed starting around the 5th or 6th clip that I never once saw it deviate from. Before it touched the gate, it would stand still for a moment, 8 to 12 seconds consistently, and tilt its head upward and to the right. Not looking at the camera, not looking at the house. Looking up and to the right at something I couldn't see, something above and beyond the frame. Every single visit, without exception. It always did that. Always. Always. I'm going to tell you what I did about it, but first, I need to tell you what I didn't do. Because the things I didn't do are the things I'm most ashamed of, and the things I've spent 11 years turning over in my hands trying to understand. I didn't call anyone. Not the DNR, not the county sheriff, not the University Extension Office in East Lansing that handles unusual wildlife reports. I didn't post the footage online. I didn't show it to my neighbor Dale, who is the closest thing I have to a friend within 20 miles, and who would have been, of all the people in my life, the most likely to believe me. I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I made a pot of coffee at 11 o'clock on a February night, and I watched all 112 clips again from the beginning, and by the end of that second viewing I had made a decision that I still cannot fully explain, except by saying that something in the footage made me feel, in a way that bypassed all of my intelligence training and all of my rational architecture, that I was not looking at a threat. I was looking at something that was curious. There is a difference. I have spent my life in environments where the distinction between a threat and a curiosity was sometimes the only thing that kept people alive. A threat has a quality of intent directed outward, toward you, with purpose that is acquisitive or territorial or predatory. A curiosity has a quality of attention that is inward-turning, self-answering, seeking information rather than contact. The animal at my gate was curious. It was curious about my property, yes, but, and this is the part I could not explain and still cannot, it seemed, on repeated viewing, to be specifically curious about the house. Not the barn, not the field, not the creek. The house. Twice in the later clips, after testing the gate, it turned and stood facing south for several seconds, facing, as best I could estimate, the direction of the farmhouse, which was visible as a light source on the southern horizon of the wide-angle image. And when it did this, its posture changed. The body softened slightly, the head came down from its raised position. It stood the way a person stands when they are looking at something they recognize and feel something about. I am not a man given to anthropomorphizing animals. Ask anyone who's hunted with me. I am the opposite of that. But I watched those clips 50 times before I saw anything else, and what I saw was not a predator casing a target. I told myself that. I told myself that for weeks. Looking back now, I can see that telling myself something is not the same as it being true. But in March of 2014, I believed it, and so I did what I did next. I started leaving food at the back gate. The first time was March 2nd, 2014. I'd been reviewing the footage for about a week. I drove my ATV up to the north end of the property at dusk with a 5-gallon bucket containing roughly 40 pounds of mixed protein. Venison scraps from the previous fall's deer, 2 large pork shoulders I'd bought at the Meijer in town, and a quantity of sweat I'd rendered myself over the winter. I hung the bucket on the inside of the gate using the wire I normally use for the latch. I didn't stay. I drove back to the house, and I sat in the kitchen and I drank whiskey and I didn't sleep, and at some point around 4 in the morning I went to bed, telling myself that nothing would happen, that the food would attract coyotes, that I'd wake up to an empty bucket and feel like a fool, and delete all 112 clips and never think about it again. In the morning, the bucket was on the ground on the outside of the gate. Empty. Not knocked over, not dragged. Placed. The bucket was upright, outside the gate, placed there by something that had the dexterity to remove it from the wire hanger, carry it over or around the gate, consume the contents, 40 pounds of meat, and set the empty bucket down upright on the far side. Placed. The snow around the gate was disturbed by large bipedal prints that walked to the gate, stood at the gate for some time based on the depth and compression of the tracks, and then walked back north into the trees. The prints were enormous. I measured the clearest one. 17 inches heel to toe, 8 inches at the widest point of the forefoot, with a distinct 5-toe spread that was wider than human proportions but recognizably similar in configuration. I stood at that gate for a long time. I was not afraid. I want to tell you that I was afraid because that would be the reasonable response, and I understand that. But I was not. What I felt, standing at that gate in the cold March morning with the empty bucket at my feet and those tracks in the snow, was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt interested. I felt, God help me, something that was almost like hope. I was 69 years old, alone on 160 acres, with a sick dog and a bad back and children who called on holidays in a past I'd mostly made my peace with. And something had taken my food. Something enormous and impossible and real had stood at my gate in the dark and taken what I'd left for it. And it had put the bucket back. It put the bucket back. I went inside and made breakfast, and by the time I'd finished eating I had decided to do it again. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that a man with my background, with my training, with my particular and hard-won understanding of what happens when humans insert themselves into relationships they don't understand. I am aware that I should have made a different decision. I know that now, in the way you know all the things you should have done differently, from the comfortable distance of years and consequence. But I was 69 and alone, and something had put the bucket back, and that detail lodged in me like a splinter, and I couldn't leave it alone. I went back the following evening with another bucket. This time I stayed. I parked the ATV about 100 yards south of the gate, downwind. I had noted from the trail camera footage that the animal always approached from the north-northwest, so I positioned myself on the south-southeast side, and I sat in my deer-blind chair in the dark at about 11 o'clock, and I waited. Petra had wanted to come. I'd left her in the house. I wasn't sure what would happen, and I wasn't willing to risk her. Nothing happened until 2:17 a.m. The sound came first, which I was not prepared for despite having listened to the audio on the trail camera clips dozens of times. The clips had thin, compressed audio through a small camera microphone. Being 50 yards from it in open air in a quiet night was a completely different experience. It was low, first, a sub-bass frequency I felt in my sternum more than heard with my ears, a rhythmic sound that I eventually identified as breathing. Very deep and measured, the way large animals breathe when they're not alarmed. And underneath that, or woven into it, a sound I can only describe as vocalizing. Not quite a call, not quite a growl, something between the two that rose and fell in a pattern that suggested, though I know how this sounds, deliberateness. A pattern. Not random animal sound, a pattern. I had night vision binoculars. I raised them, I found the gate, and I found it standing there, doing the thing I'd watched it do on all 112 clips. Tilted head, right and upward, paused for its 8 to 12 seconds, looking at something I couldn't see. From 50 yards through night vision I could see detail that the trail camera had never given me. The fur was dense and very dark brown, nearly black in the cool light spectrum of the binoculars, but along the arms and shoulders it had a slightly reddish undertone, a warmth to the color that made me think of old dried blood or very dark fox fur. The face, I caught the profile of the face, was not the face I had imagined. I had imagined something animal. What I saw was something that occupied an uncomfortable space between animal and not. The brow was heavy, the jaw pronounced, but the eyes, when it turned its head slightly and I caught a brief frontal glimpse, the eyes were forward-facing. Not the wide-set, lateral placement of a prey animal, not even the moderate placement of a predatory mammal. Forward-facing, close-set, and in the night vision spectrum they reflected the cold greenish glow of gathered light, in a way that showed them to be large and structured and aware. I did not move. I did not breathe loudly. I watched it eat from the bucket, and the dexterity with which it did this, the way it reached in and selected pieces rather than plunging its face in, the controlled and almost methodical way it fed, kept me perfectly still. Not from fear, but from the particular paralysis of witnessing something that your entire framework for reality has no appropriate response to. My training had prepared me for many things. It had not prepared me for this. When it finished, it stood at the gate again. It turned, not quickly, not startled, turning the way a person turns when they're done with a task, and it looked south, directly south, toward where I was sitting. I know it did not see me. I know the wind was right and I had not moved and the night vision gave away no light. I know all of that. But it looked south for a long moment, and in that moment something passed across its posture. A settling, a kind of stillness within the stillness. And then it turned back north and walked into the trees and was gone. I sat in that chair until daylight. By April of 2014, I had a routine. Every other evening, I drove up to the back gate at dusk and left food. Within a week, the animal had adjusted its arrival time, It had been coming between 1:30 and 2:30 a.m., but it began arriving earlier, closer to midnight, and by the middle of April it was arriving between 10 and 11 p.m., while I was still awake, still at the farmhouse, watching the live feed I had rigged from camera 4 to a small monitor on my kitchen table. I want to pause here and acknowledge that this was not a small undertaking. Rigging a live feed from a trail camera to a kitchen monitor in 2014, on a 160-acre property with a farmhouse at the south end and a gate at the north end, required running a buried cable that took me 4 days of difficult work given my back, and a relay transmitter mounted on a fence post halfway between, and a monitor I ordered online that my granddaughter helped me set up during a visit in late March. I am telling you this because the mundane difficulty of it is important. The practical problems are always what make the unbelievable feel real. I wanted to see it in real time. I needed to see it. I ran 300 yards of underground cable through partially frozen ground because I needed to watch it eat. That is the first moment I think I truly understood that what was happening to me was not just scientific curiosity. A scientist would have noted the behavior and maintained distance. What I was doing was something else, something I didn't have a word for yet. By May, it was coming every night. I had begun varying the food. I'd started with bulk protein, but I experimented with fruit, with grains, with things I wouldn't normally have associated with a large carnivore or omnivore. The venison and pork remained the core of each bucket offering, but I added apples in May, and they disappeared. I added dried corn, and it was eaten. In late May, I added, on a whim, a segment of fresh honeycomb that I'd gotten from a beekeeper at the farm market in town, and the next morning the bucket was not just empty, but had been licked to a shine I could see my reflection in. After that, I always included honey or honeycomb. Something about that delighted me. I don't entirely know why. The image of this enormous and impossible creature with its methodical, careful eating habits and its forward-facing eyes developing a preference for honey. It made me feel something close to fondness. And that fondness, I want to be honest with you, is where I began making mistakes. May slid into June, and the Michigan hardwoods came fully into leaf, and the long evenings stretched out golden and warm. And on the night of June 7th, 2014, I did something I had promised myself I would not do. I went to the gate. Not in the blind, not from a distance, not with 100 yards of safety between us. I drove the ATV to within 30 feet of the gate, and I parked it, and I sat on the front of it and I waited. I had left the bucket on the gate as usual. The evening was warm, and the tree frogs were going, and somewhere on the creek the wood ducks were making their last calls before full dark. I sat there with my .30-06 across my knees. I want to be honest about that. I was not entirely without caution, and I waited. At 10:47 p.m. by my watch, it came out of the trees. It stopped when it saw me. Or when it registered me. I believe it had already known I was there from 50 yards into the forest. But it stopped when I was visible to it, and we had a standoff. I did not raise the rifle. I did not stand up. I sat very still on the front of the ATV, and I made no sudden movements, and after perhaps 90 seconds, 90 of the longest seconds of my life, it walked forward to the gate. It did not look at me again while it ate. Not directly, but several times I caught the angle of the head shifting, the way an animal monitors a neutral presence in its peripheral field. It was aware of me. It had decided, by some process I cannot describe, that I was acceptable, that I was known. The bucket was positioned on my side of the gate, and when the food was gone it stood at the gate for a moment, and I had the very specific, very clear impression that it was deciding something. Then it reached over the gate with one long, dark arm and set the empty bucket on the ground on my side, its side of the gate, the north side. It had always put the bucket back. This was the first time it put it back on the wrong side. I have thought about that gesture for 11 years. I don't know what it meant. I have a theory. My theory is that it put the bucket on my side because I was on my side, and it knew the bucket belonged with me, and it was closing the exchange. It was acknowledging the transaction in the only language available to it. That's my theory. I hold it lightly. I drove home very slowly in the dark, and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at my hands for a while. They were not shaking, they were very still. Petra put her head in my lap and I scratched behind her ears and I said out loud, to no one, or maybe to her, or maybe to some part of myself I was only beginning to access, I think there are 2 of them. I don't know how I knew. The trail camera had only ever captured 1. I had only ever seen 1 at the gate. But there was something, a quality of awareness in the animal at the gate that I recognize now as the particular alertness of a creature that has something elsewhere it is responsible for. I know what that looks like in people. I'd seen it in soldiers who had families back home. A divided attention, a weight of accountability that runs alongside whatever else they're doing. It was there. I'd been seeing it for months without naming it. Something was waiting for it, somewhere in those 12 miles of state forest. Something it went back to every night before dawn. Always before dawn. Always. The second one didn't appear on camera until August 19th, 2014 at 11:23 p.m. I was watching the kitchen monitor when the first one came to the gate as usual, and I was already in my familiar low-level state of attention, relaxed but present, the way you sit after months of watching the same behavior, when something in the peripheral left edge of the monitor caught my eye. Movement. In the tree line, 15 or 20 yards back from where the first one had emerged. Still. Just the suggestion of a shape, holding itself away from the gate, away from the light of the infrared, keeping the first one between itself and whatever it was uncertain about. Me, the camera, the smell of the farmhouse to the south. It was smaller, noticeably smaller, the same fur, the same basic configuration of form, but perhaps a foot shorter, closer to 6 feet than 7, and slighter in the shoulders, and its posture in that first glimpse had a quality of alertness that was almost nervous, a held breath quality that the first one had never shown. I understood then what I had been intuiting since June. And I understood something else that I should have understood earlier, that any person with more emotional intelligence than I had at that moment would have understood earlier, that a person who had not been alone for 15 years and was not operating on a 2-year deficit of human connection might have understood immediately. I was looking at a family, a pair, and one of them was cautious about me because one of them had decided I was safe and the other had not yet reached that conclusion. I named them that night. I told you the names carry weight, and they do. The first one, the larger one, the one who had been coming to the gate since March, who put the bucket back and paused to look south and had a pale patch of fur on the inside of its left forearm. I named him Enoch, from the book of Genesis. The man who walked with God and was not, for God took him, who lived 365 years and disappeared without death into something larger than the world he'd inhabited. That felt right. The smaller, cautious one I named Ruth, the one who said, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay." Ruth, who attached herself out of loyalty to something foreign and uncertain. Ruth, who was afraid of me for a long time and came anyway. Ruth came to the gate for the first time on her own terms on September 3rd, 2014. Enoch was there, had already eaten, was doing his southward looking. She came out of the trees slowly, covering perhaps 10 yards in 2 minutes, pausing at each step with the complete, coiled stillness of an animal managing its own fear. She reached the gate. She stood next to Enoch, and for a moment, it is on the camera, I have watched it hundreds of times. She placed the flat of her hand, palm down, against his forearm, the left forearm, over the pale patch of fur, and held it there. I was watching on the monitor. I had to put my coffee down. I did not trust my hands. From that point, the dynamic at the gate shifted. They came together most nights. There were still nights when only Enoch appeared, and I noted, without knowing quite why, that on those nights he was sometimes late, outside the usual window, and that his southward looks were longer and seemed to carry a different quality, a checking quality, a going-back quality. On the nights both came, Ruth hung slightly behind but gradually, over weeks, moved closer to the gate, closer to the fence line, closer to the edge of the light. Her fear of me was not irrational, and I respected it. I made no sudden changes. I maintained the routine. I kept the buckets coming. I added variety when I could. I noted in early October that Ruth showed a marked preference for the fruit components of the bucket. She reliably ate the apples and the honeycomb before touching the meat, while Enoch ate protein first. I accommodated this. I bought more apples. By October, I had a separate storage bin in the barn dedicated to their food. 40 pounds of mixed protein, usually venison that I'd shot myself supplemented with commercial cuts from the butcher in town, plus whatever produce I could source affordably. The local orchard sold seconds, bruised and unsellable apples, for practically nothing, and I bought them by the bushel. I was spending, at peak, somewhere around $220 a month on food for 2 animals that did not legally exist and that I could not acknowledge to anyone. I paid for everything in cash. I drove to different stores in different towns so my purchasing patterns wouldn't register with anyone who might notice. These are the mundane, practical details that I told you about. This is what it actually looks like when the impossible becomes a logistical reality. You drive 40 minutes to a different county's mayor because you don't want the butcher's counter employee in your town to notice that you're buying 50 pounds of pork shoulder every 2 weeks and start asking questions. The winter of 2014 into 2015 was the first full winter I managed the feeding. The Michigan winters out there are real winters, sustained cold below zero, heavy lake effect snow, ice storms that close the rural roads for days. I worried about them. I had no scientific basis for that worry. They had obviously survived Michigan winters without my help, but I worried. I doubled the fat content of the food in November. Sweet, rendered pork fat, whole butter that was near expiration at the grocery, mixed into the protein. I had no idea what their thermal regulation required. I was operating on the principle that more calories in hard cold was probably not harmful. They ate everything. That winter, I also began to notice evidence of their presence beyond the gate. Not frequently, and never closer than half a mile from the farmhouse, but twice in January I found tracks in fresh snow along the creek, and once in February I found, on the eastern fence line, where the second-growth hardwoods are densest, a sight that stopped me cold in the middle of a routine perimeter walk, a large, circular depression in the snow, the kind of compression that suggests sustained occupation, accompanied by a collection of objects arranged at the southern edge of the depression. I say arranged deliberately, and I choose the word precisely. 5 smooth creek stones in a row, descending in size left to right. A piece of birch bark folded on itself once. 3 dried apple cores that I recognized as the variety I'd been buying from the orchard, placed in a cluster. And in the center of the stone row, pushed into the snow so it stood upright, a deer leg bone, stripped clean. I stood at that site for a very long time. I did not touch anything. I photographed it with my phone. the first photographs I ever took of anything connected to them. And I walked back to the farmhouse and I looked at those photographs all evening. My intelligence training kept inserting itself, generating alternative explanations. Crows arrange objects. Corvids are known to collect and displace objects, but the apple cores were my apples, from the buckets I'd been leaving at the gate. Something had carried them half a mile from the gate into the interior of the forest and placed them there. Something that also arranged creek stones in a descending row. I left a fresh apple and a piece of honeycomb at the site the next morning. It was gone by the following afternoon. I don't know what to do with that. I have never known what to do with that. Spring of 2015 brought mud season, and then green up, and then the long warm evenings I associate most strongly with what I can only call the good years. Year 2 felt different from year 1 in a way I've tried to articulate to myself many times. In year 1, everything had the quality of discovery. Each visit was a new data point. Each behavioral observation went into a mental ledger I was keeping rigorously, the way I'd been trained to document intelligence. In year 2, the ledger began to feel less important than the visits themselves. I began to arrive at the gate earlier in the evening, before it was even close to their usual time, and sit in the late light. Not watching the monitor from the kitchen. Sitting at the gate. Sitting outside in the particular golden sideways light of May and June in western Michigan, with the tree frogs starting and the whip-poor-wills calling from the hardwoods, and waiting. Not for data, just waiting. Enoch arrived first, as always, but by May of 2015 he was arriving in full dusk rather than full dark, coming out of the tree line while the sky was still that deep blue that comes just before the stars appear, and he would stand at the gate, and we would look at each other across 10 feet of fence, and I had learned by then that direct, prolonged eye contact read as challenge, so I would look slightly to the side, at the fence post, at the ground, glancing up and then away, and he did the same, that sideways periodic checking that means I see you, and I am not alarmed, and I choose to remain, and we would exist together in that space for a few minutes before he opened the bucket. Ruth came to within 5 feet of the gate in June of 2015. That was the closest she had come in the 13 months I had been feeding them. 5 feet from the gate, with the wire between us. I was on my side of the gate. She stood completely still and looked at me, not the sideways glancing. She looked at me directly, which I had learned to understand as a different gesture than challenge, more like assessment, an honest accounting of what I was. I sat on the ground, which I had found generally reduced what I interpreted as wariness in both of them, and I looked back and then looked down at my hands, and I said quietly, because I had gotten into the habit of talking to them in a low voice during visits, not because I thought they understood language, but because I thought the vocal tone carried information about emotional state, I said, "You can have the apples first tonight. I got the good ones." She stood still for another minute. Then she crossed the 5 feet to the gate and reached through the lowest gap in the bars and took an apple from the bucket. Petra died in August of 2015. She had been ill on and off for 2 years, and the illness finally won, the way it always wins, and I buried her under the big white oak at the corner of the house yard where she used to sleep in the summer. I was alone in a way that I had not been alone since 1998, since before I'd gotten her as a puppy from a litter my neighbor Dale's dog had thrown. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because the loss of Petra accelerated something that was already happening. The hole she left had a shape, and the shape was not empty for long because I was filling it. I can see that now. I can see the mechanism clearly from this distance. I was filling it with the hours I spent at the gate, with the routine of the food preparation, with the simple fundamental comfort of being needed by something that came back. They came every night. They always came back. That winter, I expanded my accommodations at the gate. I built a simple lean-to shelter on the south side of the gate, my side, with a tin roof and 3 walls of rough-cut boards from the pile of milled lumber I keep in the barn. Not for them, for me. A place to sit out of the wind and the snow and still be present. I ran a single bulb on a long extension cord from the fence post, a red, incandescent bulb. I'd read somewhere that many animals don't respond to red light the way they respond to white, and my own observation suggested that the infrared in the trail camera caused more alertness than the visible spectrum lantern light I'd been using. And that became the light of our evenings together for the next 3 years. Red light inside a rough board shelter at the north fence line in the Michigan cold. Enoch and Ruth on the other side of the gate. Me on mine. By winter of 2016, Ruth took food from my hand. I want to be careful how I describe this because I don't want to sensationalize it. It was not dramatic. It was not a cinematic moment. It was a cold Tuesday night in late November. The thermometer outside the barn said 11 degrees, and Ruth had arrived at the gate before Enoch for the first time. He was late by about 40 minutes, which had happened 3 or 4 times since fall, and she was waiting at the gate, and I had the apples in my hand because I'd been carrying them from the ATV and hadn't put them in the bucket yet. She looked at the apples in my hand. I held one out through the gate bars at the lowest gap, the same gap she'd first reached through in June of 2015. She looked at it. She looked at my face. She reached through and took it. Her fingers, and I use that word because there is no other accurate word, the digits were fingers, 4 plus an opposable structure, enormously larger than human proportions, but fingers. Her fingers closed around the apple and did not touch my hand. She pulled it through the gap. She stepped back and ate it. I went inside that night and sat at the kitchen table and cried. I am not a man who cries easily, but I sat at my kitchen table in the red-tinged dark. The extension cord light was still on at the gate, visible from the kitchen window as a faint, warm glow at the far north end of the property. And I cried for about 10 minutes, for Petra, for my son, for my ex-wife, for the years of distance I'd maintained from everything that could hurt me, and how little good it had ultimately done. I cried because a 6-foot creature that shouldn't exist had taken an apple from me on a cold Tuesday, and it had felt like the most significant thing that had happened to me in 20 years, and I was old enough to understand what that said about the preceding 20 years. And what it said was not comfortable. The good years. 2015, 2016, 2017. I can tell you the texture of them, the rhythm of the preparations, the specific weight of the buckets, the smell of the lean-to in winter, cold board, and the lantern warmth and pine sap from the nearby trees, and, underneath all of it, a musk I associated with them, that I noticed first on my gloves and later on the boards of the lean-to. A deep organic smell somewhere between wet earth and something older, not unpleasant. The smell of something that lived fully outside in all weather. The concentrated essence of the forest carried on fur. The sounds of their eating. The sound of Ruth sorting through the bucket for apples. The sound, and I do not have a better word for this, of Enoch's breathing in the cold, visible as vapor in the lantern light, measured and deep. The way, by 2017, they had stopped startling at sounds from the south. Passing trucks on the distant road, a coyote's call, the occasional crack of a tree in extreme cold, and simply held still for a moment and then returned to the bucket. They had calibrated me. They had calibrated my property. It was known territory to them. I was a known element within it. I don't know what I was to them. I know what they were to me. I know it precisely, and it is not something I'm proud of in the uncomplicated way. But it is true. They were what I was living for. those visits were the fixed point around which my days organized themselves. That is exactly why I missed the signs. The first sign was in spring of 2017. April. Enoch arrived at the gate with a wound on his right shoulder, a deep laceration, the flesh open and dark in the red light, which he favored but which he did not seem to want me near. When I moved close to the gate on that side, he shifted his body to keep the wound away from me. Not aggressively, protectively. I noted the wound. I noted that it was consistent with, and I had to think about this carefully, a slash rather than a bite. Clean edges and a long curve, not a claw mark from another animal, or not a common animal. I told myself it was a territorial dispute, a rival male animals fight. This was nothing unusual. It was 3 weeks before the wound was gone. During those 3 weeks, Ruth came to the gate only twice. On both of those nights she arrived after Enoch, stood well back in the tree line, and did not approach the gate. Her stillness had a different quality than her usual caution. It was not the poised, coiled stillness of an animal managing its own fear. It was collapsed stillness, compressed, the stillness of something carrying a weight. The second sign was that summer. July. I found the lean-to had been accessed from the outside. The boards on the north-facing wall had been pressed inward at one corner, not broken, not violent, but tested. Something had pressed against the boards from outside and found the give in them. The indentation was at a height of approximately 7 feet from the ground. I repaired the boards and added bracing, and I told myself, and here the retrospective self-commentary comes in. Here is where I look back and hear my own rationalizations running and want to take myself by the collar. I told myself that this was curiosity, that the same quality of curiosity that had brought Enoch to the gate in the first place was now extending to my infrastructure. I told myself this was a positive development. I told myself it showed trust. I should have known then. The third sign, the one I have no good rationalization for, even looking back, even trying to reconstruct the psychology of how I dismissed it, came in October of 2017. I arrived at the gate later than usual, close to midnight, having spent the evening dealing with a slow drain in the kitchen that had turned into a 3-hour plumbing problem. I pulled up to the lean-to in the ATV, unloaded the bucket, and was reaching to hang it on the gate hook when I noticed that the bucket from the previous night was still hanging on the hook. I hadn't checked the gate camera feed the previous evening. The kitchen plumbing had also been preceded by a long day of fence repair, and I'd fallen asleep early, and I'd missed the fact that they hadn't come the night before. That had not happened in over 2 years. A missed night. 2 missed nights in a row, I later determined, reviewing the camera footage. They had not come to the gate on October 12th or October 13th. They came on October 14th. Only Enoch, he was late, nearly 2 a.m., and he ate quickly and without the settled quality I associated with his usual visits. He was present but not relaxed. He kept looking north, back toward the forest, with an alertness that I recognized as surveillance rather than habit. He looked north the way a soldier looks toward a position he is not certain about. Checking. Scanning. Something in the trees to the north was unknown to him, or known and concerning. He did not do his southward look that night. Not once. He ate, and he went back into the trees, and he was gone in under 10 minutes. I sat in the lean-to for a long time afterward. I thought about the wound in April. I thought about the 2 missed nights. I thought about the way he'd looked north. And I thought about what I had known for 4 years and had never fully articulated, which was this. They were not alone in those 12 miles of state forest. They were not the only ones of their kind in that territory. I had found the site with the arranged stones and the apple cores, and I had found 2 other disturbed sites along the creek in the intervening years. places where something large had rested, where grass was matted and branches were broken at height, and I had always interpreted these as evidence of Enoch and Ruth ranging on their property. But the wound in April had clean edges, and the 2 missed nights in October had a quality of disruption that wasn't the ordinary variation of animal routine. Something had changed in the forest. Some pressure had arrived or escalated. I planted this as a small thing in my mind and covered it, and tried to let it grow slowly, tried to let myself understand it at the pace that was safe. Looking back, I see that I should have let it grow faster. I should have followed it to its conclusion before the conclusion arrived on its own. The year everything broke. It began breaking slowly, the way these things do. January was fine. February was fine. The cold was extreme, 17 below on 3 consecutive nights in late February, and I worried and doubled the food, and they came faithfully, both of them, both whole and present. March brought mud and ice and the particular cabin fever of a Michigan late winter, and I was more present at the gate than I'd been in years, spending 3 and sometimes 4 hours a night in the lean-to, which I'd now insulated with rigid foam board on the interior walls, and which held heat well enough to be, if not comfortable, survivable. Ruth had, by this point, progressed to taking food directly from my hand, as a matter of routine rather than exception. Enoch had allowed me, twice in 2017, to touch the fur of his forearm through the gate. Not a pet, not a deliberate contact, more like the back of my knuckle brushing against his arm when I handed something through. And he had not withdrawn. These small accumulations of proximity felt each time like a privilege I had not earned and should not become accustomed to. In late March of 2018, Ruth said something to me. I know how that sentence reads. I know. I have written it and deleted it and written it again for 11 years, and there's no better sentence for what happened, so it stays. On the night of March 24th, 2018, at approximately 11:30 p.m., with Enoch eating from the bucket and Ruth standing to his left, I was sitting cross-legged on the ground on my side of the gate. I'd taken to sitting on the ground during visits, winter cold notwithstanding, because it seemed to produce the most neutral posture, and I was saying something low and ordinary, the way I talked to them during visits, narrating the day or talking about nothing in particular. And Ruth turned and looked at me and produced, clearly and deliberately, a sound that had 2 distinct components and a gap between them. The first component was a mid-register vocalization that rose slightly in pitch. The second, after the gap, was a lower, sharper sound, almost a click consonant. Together they formed something that had the duration and the rhythmic shape of a short word. My name. Not my name, I don't believe she knew my name, but the sound she had heard me use most often in the 2 years she'd been within auditory range of my voice. The sound I used most when talking to myself or to the memory of Petra, which was hey. The sound I made at the beginning of sentences. Hey, it was not a perfect replication. It was not a human sound, but it was an intentional production of a sound she had identified as meaningful, directed at me, during a communicative context. 2 syllables, a gap, a look at my face afterward. I said, very carefully and quietly, "Hey, Ruth." She looked at me for another moment. Then she turned back to the bucket and took an apple. I drove.